I'm Laura Bonnell, and this is the Living with Cystic Fibrosis podcast coming to you from Detroit. Please subscribe and even rate and comment on our podcasts when it moves you. I learn something new with every podcast, and I'm always inspired by the people that are showcased here. We don't give medical advice. You need to connect with your doctor for that. I hope that this Living with Cystic Fibrosis podcast educates you and sparks some volunteering or advocacy. The CF community needs people like you. Thanks to our sponsors, Viatris and Vertex, for their support. Well, if you lose a child to cystic fibrosis, what does that do to parents, to their identity, and to their place in the CF community? These are hard discussions to have, but for a couple of years now, Peggy Hawkins and myself have been talking about getting her on this podcast to talk about that very subject. Peggy and her husband are the parents of 3 men. She lives in South Carolina now, but was born and raised in Detroit. And Peggy worked as a nurse for 43 years, which is incredible. Their oldest son, Chris, is 37 years old, and their youngest is 31 years old. Stephen, who died from complications of cystic fibrosis, was the middle child. He died, sadly, tragically, at 29 years old. And Peggy, welcome to the podcast. I know this is so hard. It's been, 4 years?
Be 5 years, February 1st. So.
Obviously, anybody who's lost someone knows you never get over it. You sort of move on. Stephen was diagnosed at 2 months old, and you were aware that cystic fibrosis was on your side of the family. A paternal aunt had CF, but your husband didn't know that there was any history in his family. Right. And then when Stephen's tasted salty, which is a huge red flag for cystic fibrosis, you had him tested and he was positive. So what were your thoughts that day?
Well, it was devastating, obviously. I was home alone. My husband was at work when I called the physician's office to get the results, and they told me, he wasn't there, but he just so happened to walk by, and he got on the phone and told me it was positive. And, of course, I was devastated. I had a 2-year-old, and my husband was at work, and it was just me. And I remember, I think I called my parents first to let them know, and waited, of course, until my husband got home. But it was devastating. It was devastating. And being a nurse, I knew, even though I didn't learn that much about CF in nursing school, I knew that it was not good.
So Stephen was 29. My girls are 30 and 27. So much has changed in that time that our kids were born. Back then, we didn't have CF modulators. Right. We didn't have so much hope that there is now, even though it's still a deadly disease. Right. So it was a different time. Right. I cried all the time thinking about it. I thought about their funerals all the time. I thought about, I'm going to lose them around this age, I'm guessing, even though you're positive all the time. So I just wondered, from diagnosis, what did this do to your marriage? What did this do at work? And then, as I've said before, no judgment. I had a second child knowing I had a first one with CF. Why did you make that decision for a third?
Well, I guess because we had 2 boys and I wanted to try for a girl. And I had looked at it, my husband and I obviously had talked about it. And I looked at it as that there was a 75% chance that the child would not have it. So I was, thinking, okay, we'll go with that one. And we decided to have another child. My father was not really happy, but of course after the baby was born. But I told him, I said, Daddy, I'm looking at it positively in the fact that 75% chance that the child won't have it. And if they do, we know what to do. Because Stephen at that time was almost, was he 3? Well, he was 3 when Kevin was born. So we had, 3 years under our belt of what to do. And so, I would have been devastated, but I think I could have handled it a lot more. But it wasn't an easy decision. And of course, my doctor kept asking me, do you want to, at that time, they didn't do the newborn testing, but if I wanted amniocentesis, and I said, no, I wouldn't do anything. I'm not going to change anything, so I'd rather not know. So, and fortunately, he was negative, and so, yeah.
And it is so interesting because my husband, Joe, has 7 siblings, and I have 2, and our thought after Molly was we can't just have one child. We wanted a big family, but we didn't we didn't go any further after Emily was born. But same thing. I did do the amnio because I wanted to find out what else was going on. I didn't find out about CF because that didn't matter, but I did want to know if there were more issues that I needed to find out about. And then same, although I thought 1 in 4 chance with each pregnancy, how could it happen twice?
Right.
Naively back then. But of course, we have no regrets. But I also wonder, did this impact your marriage? Because I do think it's hard. I think we either unite and we're like, okay, you're doing the treatments. Like for us, Joe had the healthy child all the time, and I had to go part-time at my job and then stay with the sick kid in the hospital all the time. So that worked out for us, but I think moms are more involved. So how did that work for you?
Well, I could ask, my husband was great. Now, he worked in a factory, so he worked like 4 days, and then he had 3 days off. And he also worked overtime because during that time I was not working. But he was great about doing the treatments and, coming to the appointments if he could. And if Stephen didn't start going into the hospital until he was 11 years old. So by that time, he knew what he wanted to do. And a lot of times he wanted his dad to stay, and my husband would do that. But I think it strengthened our marriage. We united and had to be, because we also had 2 other children. And that's a big balance, trying to, not devote all your time, but yet it still takes a lot of time. And then worrying about your other children. Are you, giving them the attention they need and doing? But I can honestly say that, of course, we all make mistakes, and it's a learning curve. Nobody tells you how to be a parent, and then they certainly don't tell you how to be a parent of a child that has something like cystic fibrosis. So my other children, and actually Stephen too, did not lack for anything. So, and like I said, it strengthened our marriage, I believe. Yeah, definitely.
That is wonderful. And I laugh too. I think about the girls. Joe was doing high ponytails, and it was a big thing. Like, Dad's doing the ponytails in the morning, getting us off to school. He could never be on time. They were always late. But it was a very funny thing that they laugh about to this day. So, yeah, it is good. And then about work, I wondered, did you have to go part-time? Did it do anything to your job like it did for me?
Well, no, being a nurse, at the time especially, you can pretty much write your own hours and that stuff. So what I would do is that I would, like I said, when Jeff had 4 days off, he would work maybe 1 day overtime, and then I could work either 2 or 3 days when he was off, so that we didn't have to put Stephen in daycare. So somebody was always with him. And so I just worked, a couple days. And as Stephen got older and I was doing that, he was kind of a mama's boy. And he wanted me to be home. You were supposed to get off at 7, and here it's 8, 9 o'clock, and I'm still, working. And so I think at that point, it's been a while, but I think at that point I ended up stopped working. And my husband, he would, did most of the working. So I stayed home with Stephen. But, we still did the sharing of the duties and stuff. But he would work more overtime and stuff, because it just really, it hit my heart when he would call me and say, Mama, why aren't you home? And, I need you. And so, yeah.
It's so hard. And, we have so much guilt, and we have so much. When I think back to when they were young and we're cleaning all the equipment, and we've got hospital visits and we have work, there is so much going on. How was your guilt level? I know you talked about just being a nurse, and you said to your doctor you thought you should have seen this and known about cystic fibrosis, and he said something very nice to you.
Yes, he did. He told me, Peggy, no, you should not know this, because you are Stephen's mother, not his nurse. And that was when Stephen was diagnosed, or the diagnosis was confirmed. And so that kind of gave me a kind of a peace, because I felt like, I should know this. I'm a nurse. But like I said, we only learned about a paragraph about CF when I was in nursing school back in 1980. So, I really didn't know. I just knew about my aunt. And at that time, they didn't do anything except hang her over the bed and pat on her back. So I had no clue. So that was good, because then I had to get out of the nurse mode and remind myself that I am his mother. But it did come in handy, like when he'd have to come home or do IV antibiotics at home. I was able to do that and do his dressing changes, so we didn't have to have other people coming in the house to do that. So
we felt like a nurse after all this. You feel like, wow, I really know what I'm doing. I can push, do that IV push and all that stuff. So it is kind of funny, I guess, in that sense. But I wonder, how was Stephen? My girls were so different. One was healthier than the other, and so they both went through different things. And with Stephen, he has 2 siblings that don't have CF. So we're talking about guilt again, but how did the other boys feel? How did everyone's emotions go as you were raising 3 boys and one with CF?
It was hard, of course, and trying to explain, especially when they were younger. Like I said, Stephen was healthy, did not have to go in the hospital until he was 11 years old, and that's when he started. So I believe it was maybe around that time or maybe a little bit before that my husband and I sat all 3 boys down, and because I said I wanted them to hear about this, explain a little bit more. And at that time, the life expectancy wasn't that great. And so I wanted them to hear from us. And so we sat them down, we explained and, told them that this is what could happen and this is why we have to do this. And, Stephen may not be here because he'll have to be in the hospital. And so, and I think, they pretty much understood and accepted it. And of course, it was a difficult conversation to have because Stephen was 9, so my oldest was 12, my youngest was 6, and to explain to them, that there's a possibility that Stephen could die. But like I said, I wanted him to hear from us rather than somebody else or, somebody talking about another child that had passed away or something. I didn't want him to hear that. So there probably was a little bit of jealousy, but when Stephen became a Make-A-Wish child, we all benefited from that. So they did not miss out. I mean, they always could count on that. As the person in our hometown would always say, we can always count on the Hawkins. So they would call us and ask us to come. So they had the benefit of that. And, I look back, I think, they encouraged Stephen Stephen did the same things that they did, playing just like boys do and playing sports. So, but I'm sure there was probably some jealousy along the way, and especially as they got older. I know sometimes there was tension in the house, but, they loved their brother and, so they kind of understood.
And then things kind of take a turn in 2015 when his health is deteriorating. Then he had a transplant in 2016, and that is really a scary place to be. And I think now, just this year, the adult CF clinics are just now starting to educate people with CF about lung transplantation. Really, when Stephen was around, nobody was giving you information prior to. You were just all of a sudden lung transplant time and had to go from 0 to 1 million.
Exactly.
So I would imagine that was horrible.
It was. And I know it was, devastating to Stephen because, Stephen was very independent. And a lot of times when he'd have to go in the hospital, we'd take him down to Charleston and he'd say, just drop me off at the door and I'll see you in 2 or 3 weeks. And before he started really going bad, the surgeons would come in and talk to him, and it upset him, especially since his parents weren't around. And he told the CF doctor, and he said, Stephen, that's just the way they are. Just go home, talk to your parents. And Stephen had always said he didn't want to do it, but he was going to do it for us. But I think in 2015, he had to be airlifted from our home to Charleston, South Carolina. And I think that was a wake-up call for him. And he said, okay, I'll do it. Because I always told him, don't do it for us. You're the one going through that. And I mean, it was shocking and to go through all that stuff and to learn about all that stuff and what they would have to go through. And of course, the complications related to the meds and all that stuff. So, it was tough, but it was a decision that he had to make because at that time he was 25. So he was an adult and it was his decision. And he finally decided that he was going to do it. And so that started the process. And I think one of the hardest things for me during that time was when he had to fill out a healthcare power of attorney. And I'm thinking, my 25-year-old son should not be doing this. He should be thinking about dating and a career. So that is part of the process that's very difficult. So it is tough. And I'm glad to hear that they are starting to do that, because you really do need to be educated and know, and you have to go in with, of course, the right frame of mind. And they do all that testing and talking. And, it's not like just, okay, we're taking you into surgery. There's a long, long thing to go. And you might be turned down, as Stephen was turned down by 3 transplant centers. And finally, the one that he was diagnosed at accepted him. So that was a relief, because I'm thinking, what am I going to do? What are we going to do?
Right. And for anyone that doesn't know, for my girls, it was they were terrified about the prospect of a lung transplant and not getting information. And me telling them is not the same as them having a conversation with their doctors. So that's great that they started it, because one of my daughters said, wow, I'm not as fearful. It's still terrifying, but at least, education is power, as they say.
Oh, yeah.
But I also am, in contact with a mom now whose daughter's been on the transplant list for 80 days. That stress, the stress of the transplant, is your child going to make it through the transplant? Exactly. Are they going to come out okay? Is there going to be an infection? Will the bacteria like B. cepacia or something else from their nose infect their lungs?
Right.
I mean, kind of tell us that journey of how, you must not breathe for the whole process.
Yeah, it was difficult, definitely going through, he of course went through where his CF center, that was the first one, and they turned him down, and then several others when they received the report from that. And then Duke said that they would take him, and that was a relief, because it was like I said, it was like, okay, before we knew they would, I was like, what are we going to do? I'm not going to let my child die. So I would, of course, done anything, and my husband, to move heaven and earth if we had to. But it is a difficult process. There's a lot to go through, a lot of testing. They also do, psychological on you, because you're going to be the caregiver. You have to make sure you have a backup caregiver, and, the financial part of it, and, where you're going to stay, and all that factors into it. And so it is a long, drawn-out process. But I will say, Stephen, we started in June of 2016, his rehab, and had finished it sometime in July. He was fortunate, he was only on the transplant list, I believe it was like 13 days, 2 or 3 weeks, maybe just 2 or 3 weeks. It wasn't very long, and I know there are a lot of them that are, but there's so many factors that play into it. So you just have to, I'd say, be the right time kind of thing. And they are so good about what they take and that, fit the child or the patient to the right set of lungs. And sometimes they're not, and we had 2 failed calls that the lungs weren't any good, but that was tough. That was a roller coaster, because one time we had to wait like 13 hours to find out that the lungs were no good. But, of course, that's what we want to make sure that they are. But it does take a toll on you, both physically, emotionally, and not just me as a caregiver or my husband, because he was back at home, working, but also on Stephen, of course. It is tough.
And not to get sidetracked on insurance and everything, but my gosh, when your child is going through that, someday everybody's going to get paid to be with their kids and not have to go into work. That is just a sin to me, that both parents during that time cannot be with their child.
Yes.
We really we have a lot to fix and a lot of legislation to work on, because every time I hear this, it makes me crazy and angry. But you make it through the transplant, and then take us through, coming out of that.
They do the post after they get up and moving around and stuff. But Stephen had developed an infection so he was in the hospital a little bit longer. But when he was released, it was a very happy day. But I remember when Stephen it was very fortunate. His surgery only lasted 6 hours, and he didn't have much adhesion, so they were able to, pretty much get his lungs out fairly easily. But I remember my husband did come up, and the doctor told me he had to, I know you want to go see your son. So he took us, but my husband had a cold, but he said, you mask up, what you have to do anyway, and gown and all that stuff, and just stay away, but go and see him. So I remember asking the nurse, when are they going to take the tube out? Because, of course, Stephen was out of it. And I said, because I am exhausted. I'm going to take my husband back to where we're staying. And she said, oh, they won't do it till tomorrow morning. I said, okay, I'll be back. Well, 2, 3 o'clock in the morning, I get a phone call, and it's Stephen.
Oh, my God.
Mama, where are you? And I'm like, what? And he's like, aren't you coming up here to take a picture? And I can hear the nurse laughing in the background. And she's like, Stephen, everything will be the same tomorrow. Your mom can come up then. But it was just so funny. Of course, he never let me forget that I missed him taking his first breath with his new lungs. But I told him I was there when you took your first breath, when you came into this world. So, but it is a roller coaster. He had a lot of sinus issues post-transplant that he had kind of not had. He had some before, but right before they kind of leveled off. But he had I think 6 surgeries post-transplant. And of course, all that stuff goes down into the lungs. So we were there for a year and a half. But I wanted to be close because he had some other issues. He had some reaction to some of the meds. And unfortunately, he developed post-transplant cancer. But fortunately, they found it in time and they were able to, treat it. And it got rid of it. But that, all that.
Not sorry to interrupt.
No,
but
that's okay.
That post-transplant cancer I've just been learning about, that happens so much more than I had no idea.
Yeah, that was a new to me too. I didn't know. And of course, some of the CFers that were with Stephen in his group ended up having it a lot worse. Some of them had it, more than one time and stuff, and then some didn't have it. So we were fortunate they caught it in time, so that they were able to treat it.
Before transplant, I can only imagine you're terrified he might not make it through the transplant, as he, I'm sure, is too. And then after that, you must have felt euphoric, I would think.
Definitely. It was, like I said, it was a roller coaster of emotions. Of course, when you go in and see him after they get him into his room in intensive care, and of course he's out of it, and he's pale and he's cold. But at the same time, it warms your heart because you know that my child's going to, he has a second chance at life. And I'm forever, ever grateful to his donor family. I pray for them every day. To me, it's amazing. I said it's the most unselfish gift that any human being can give to another human being. And it definitely roller coaster of emotions. But it was exciting to see Stephen being able to be perky and breathing on his own and not carrying the oxygen tank and not having to worry about that because his, levels were very low right before transplant. So it was nice to see him happy and quote unquote normal.
And what were his thoughts for his future after coming through this transplant?
Well, that's funny because one of the things that they ask the transplantees or future ones, what are your goals after transplant? And of course, his first one was to be able to play golf again. That's his big one. Then he wanted to go back to school. Of course, he wanted to get married and possibly have children and have a career. So those were, I would say, his goals. And unfortunately, I'm trying to think if he went back to school, if he had the chance or before. It kind of blurs all together sometimes. But he did make it that he was able to play golf again. So that was one that he wanted. And of course, the other thing that he wanted to do was to advocate for CF awareness and, of course, organ donation. And I would say, Stephen was a very giving child. I think when children have something like CF, and you may with your daughters, but I think they have more empathy than a lot of others. And that is one thing that I would say that I learned from Stephen. And he was, there are some that he knew that had second, third transplants. And Stephen told me, he said, Mama, if it comes to that, I don't want another one. He said, because I had my chance, I want somebody else to have a chance. And that just was the way he was. Of course, when reality hit that he was in chronic rejection, it may not have been the same, but that's only natural. It's human. But I don't know if he would have had another one or not. But he was very caring and giving. So it was. And for all of us, it was a roller coaster of emotions. Of course, my husband came up as much as he could. We went home a couple times. So because my husband, was, of course, worried about him. So it was, like I said, it's euphoric, but it's also scary.
And what was his career plan? Did he have one yet?
Yes, he wanted to go do something in business. I'm not exactly sure what, but it was in business. In fact, before transplant, when he graduated from high school, he had gotten himself a 4-year scholarship to the school he wanted, and it was for business. And unfortunately, then he wasn't even there, or maybe it was a year, but he had to give it up and moved back home because he was so ill and all the time missing classes. So he ended up going to the local technical college, but that's what he wanted to do, something in business. He wasn't sure. But then he changed post-transplant. He was looking into going to school for radiology of some kind he wanted to do. He was trying to figure what you wouldn't have that much contact with people, or that long period of time. And one of the things he wanted to do was mammograms, but they don't let males. So he decided that, some type of radiology was what he was going. And I think his transplant had a lot to do with that he wanted to do something in the healthcare career to give back.
That is wonderful. I'm glad you are keeping his story alive. It's so important. So when he's 29, he's had rejection, and then you lose him.
Yeah. Yeah, that was, prior to that, Stephen, between August of 2015 and November of 2015, he had been in the hospital 4 different times. And the last time in November, I happened to run into his doctor who was on call, and he kind of gave me the indication that there was not much that they could do. And I'm not sure if Stephen knew that, because he protected me. He kept a lot of things from me, and that was his way of protecting me. But I don't know if they told him that or not. But then when we went back for his post-hospital transplant in December, I made my husband come, make sure he was there, and the doctor told him. And I remember Stephen was on the table and laying down. I remember looking over, and his lip was just quivering. And I thought, I just wanted to burst into tears. I was like, I couldn't do anything, and of course his question was, there's nothing else we can do, and basically my husband when we were done with the appointment, he had taken Stephen out in the wheelchair, and the head of the department was there, and I started crying, and he said, Peggy, take Stephen home and make memories, because he's here right now. And of course, we had no idea when, but even till the end, Stephen was asking, is there anything you can do? And they pretty much said, that's it. And Stephen was very open and honest talking about dying. He was not afraid to die, but he was afraid of leaving all of us. And that was his big thing. But I know maybe it was a couple of weeks, I think, before he passed away, that we were talking, and he started crying, and he asked me, Mama, why do I have to have CF? And it just broke my heart, because I didn't know what to say. We're supposed to be their protectors. We're supposed to save them and help them and do things, and there's nothing that I could do. And that was very devastating, very hard, because I didn't have the answer. And to see your child cry.
Right. It's horrible.
It's horrible.
And so how are you all preparing yourself, knowing what's happening and watching, Stephen?
Yeah, that was difficult. My older son had already moved away. He had moved to Greenville, South Carolina, like maybe 4 or 5 years, maybe not that long. But he had already moved out of the house. So it was only Kevin and Stephen that were still at home. And I don't remember exactly how we told my older son, if he had come home, or we told him over the phone. But it was hard. It was hard to go home, but we did make memories. And I think that the best thing that we ever did was Stephen had wanted a emotional support animal, but he couldn't decide between a bloodhound, basset hound, or a Great Dane. So it just so happened in our paper there was a story about a man who raised bloodhounds, and he had given 2 of them to the local sheriff's department. So I said to my husband, let's get this for Stephen, because I knew that was his last Christmas, and I don't care, what it cost or anything, it's going to be worth it. So we decided, and we told Stephen, and we went out, and he picked the one he wanted, and she was a shy one that you have to watch out for, those shy ones. I'd say Stephen's up there laughing every time she does something, but brought him home, and it was amazing to see in 6 weeks how they bonded. And she knew when Stephen wasn't feeling good because she would not. I remember the Sunday before he passed away, I had taken her in there and she crawled right up and put her head on his chest. And usually her nose was, because Stephen lived in chaos, or that was he knew where everything was, and she would, sift everything. But that day she knew, and he held her for as long as he could. And then his chest, it was hurting. So I took her, but when he got sick, and they told us that there was nothing to do, and the nurse, he was on hospice, and the nurse put Bailey up there, and it was amazing. She knew, and she was, comforting. And when he passed away, my older son had said, Bailey laid under the hospital the whole time you were at the funeral home. So it's amazing how they can do it. But it was not an easy conversation to have. And of course, you could just look at Stephen and knew that he was not doing well. Because I do have a picture of him that holding Bailey as his Christmas present. And it's not the best picture, but it means a lot to me. So, but you could tell he wasn't feeling well. So it was, said it was hard. But the day he went into the hospital was on a Thursday, and he called me in the room and he said, "Mama, this is what I want you to do. Is go take your shower, eat your breakfast, and then call 911 because I need to go to the hospital." And that's when they basically told us, that there was nothing. And his doctor happened to be on call because they had called him. They wanted to send him back to Duke, but he would have had to be on a ventilator, and Stephen did not want that. Stephen knew exactly everything he wanted. So his doctor, he had called, and he's like, "Mama, put him on speaker." And he said, "Dr. Severe, I can't, there's nothing else you can do." And he's like, "Stephen, I'm sorry, but no." And you could just see he was crestfallen. Again, he protected me because he sent me out of the room, and he had asked his uncle and my husband to stay. And he said, "Uncle Darrell, will you say a prayer with me?" So he did that. And then they sent him home on hospice, and he was surrounded. I said he was surrounded. He came into this world surrounded by love, and he left this world surrounded by love because I had called my siblings. They all came. A couple of my nieces came. My dad, of course, he lived in town, but he was there, and Stephen's two best friends were there. And, of course, his two brothers and my husband and I. It was very difficult. It was, but, I look back, I was strong. I was trying to be strong. I cried, of course, but I was trying to, because everybody else was just a basket case. So
I would say you were strong, and it sounds like a beautiful farewell, even though obviously it's horrific.
It is horrific. And, Stephen was, he was alert some of the time, and I kind of wish that I had talked to him a little bit more, especially when he first came home from the hospital. But, you have to do all that paperwork and all these questions. And I'm just thinking, please let me go see my child. I want to see him, because he had been calling for me the day before when his dad stayed up at the hospital, but with him. But yeah, it was, we had the priest come and give him last rites, and he was alert for that, thanked him, and he was in and out of it, of course. But yeah, I'll never forget. I stayed downstairs with him the night before, and the mask kept coming off of him, and he'd be yelling, "Help, help." And then the last time that happened, I knew the end was near. And he, during that period, like I said, everybody was there. We had got everybody there, and I laid on the bed with him for a long time, held his hand, and I did, like, I don't know how long it was before he passed away, but I did whisper into his ear, and I told him, "Stephen, it's okay. You can go. We're going to miss you terribly, but we will be okay." And he finally, I think, eventually did. I don't know how long after, but I think sometimes they need to get the permission to let you know that it's okay.
And now, these years later, how do you feel? I've talked to, a couple moms who've also lost a child, and identity is sometimes like, are you still a CF mom? Are you in the CF community? I mean, I would say absolutely yes. But what does that do to your identity, and still having two kids and going on with your life and not crying 24/7?
Well, I'll say one thing I It was difficult. Like I said, I was very strong for everybody. We had several deaths that year, and of course COVID, so that didn't help things. But I was trying to be strong for everybody, and then it hit me one day. I was like, okay, now I have to find my purpose is gone. He was my purpose, even though I still had two children, and of course they're adults, but they still need you and my husband. But I felt like I needed a purpose, so I had to find a new purpose. And I did find, and I think that has helped me. I joined an online grief group that it has been a godsend. And then, I can now I'm one of the moderators, so I can share Stephen's story, I share my story, and I still belong to an online CF Mamas group. I don't go on it as much as I used to, but I do still, like, if I look on it and offer my advice. And one thing on that one of my friends, I found out after Stephen passed away that she had been talking to Stephen and he'd been talking to her, and he helped her with her child because he had already been through those stages. And that just made me, of course, made me feel very proud. But it's been difficult, but I try to stay involved because that is one of the things, like I said, he wanted. And so now I'm carrying on to bring awareness to CF. And it recently in September of last year, was the guest speaker at a CF fundraiser. And, I'm very much into doing that. And also Stephen wanted to do organ donation awareness. So I'm doing both of those in his memory. And I think, we're close to the cure, but we're still not there yet. I mean, all these meds are wonderful. And unfortunately, I know Stephen wouldn't have been able to take some of it because he was involved in a lot of research. And some of those were the things he ended up having a reaction to. But I was very proud of Stephen for doing that because he wanted to help, futures. And I think he did, and any of them that go into that research, but it's difficult sometimes to think about it. But at the same time, it's comforting to me to be able to share his story and my story. And so that is one new purpose. And then I also took up crafting, and my craft room is Stephen's room. And of course, that was very difficult to go through. It took me 4 years to go through his stuff. I cried, walked away, went back, cried. And I know when I go home, I have to do some more of it, but I feel peace and comfort there. I feel like Stephen's there. And another thing, try to look for positives. And I started collecting angels even before Stephen passed away. But right before Stephen passed away, there was a cardinal in the back of our yard that my sister took a picture of. And there's a saying that when angels appear, or when angels, what is it? Yeah, they know. When angels appear, cardinals are near. And we have a family of cardinals. And after Stephen passed away, they disappeared. And I was devastated till Mother's Day. And there was a male cardinal, and I knew it was Stephen, letting me know he's okay and happy Mother's Day. So they still come, and I look at it as a very positive thing that he's letting me know. And sometimes you have to do that.
And I'm so glad, because I was going to ask you if you see signs, because
Yes.
Every person that's lost a child that I've talked to, they absolutely have. And as we wrap up here, I want to say that you are strong. I know you maybe think you weren't in some situations, but yes, you are strong. And I appreciate you sharing your story, because people listening are going to take so much from this. Mm-hmm. You're living the nightmare none of us want to have. Right. And you sharing everything you've gone through is so important to all of us. So thank you. And I want you to wrap this up any way you want. You can tell us what brings you joy, or how you remember Stephen, or anything that you want to say to people listening.
Okay. Well, first, I want to thank you for having me. And like I said, it's comforting to me. It brings me comfort and peace to be able to talk to him. And I think that's important for anybody that loses a child, no matter what, is to not be afraid, or people sometimes are. We want to hear their names. We want to hear their memories that you have of them. And I have my days, like this past holiday season was very difficult for me. And somebody told me, if you're out in the store and you feel like crying, just cry. Who cares? So, and I've done that. And it's very easy I could have, after my dad died in November of 2020, I think a lot of it was from heartbreak. Then, I was involved with that. And after his estate and everything was settled, then reality hit me. Yes, they're both gone. They really are gone. And sometimes I have to sit and think, it's really strange because I'm thinking, is he really gone? Stephen's really gone. And I know where he is. Thank God I have my faith because I don't know how I get through. But just doing the crafting, like I said, and being in his room is comforting for me. My husband, he won't go into his room, and I think he's having a little bit more difficult time. But I think we've grown closer because a lot of times that breaks up a lot of marriages. But we have to be there for one another as a family, and it affects everyone differently. That's the other thing too. I was going to say, it affects you all as a family, but then it also affects you how your relationship with that child. And so I think of Stephen often, but like I said, I know where he is. I know sometimes he'll send me a sign, like I've heard him knock on the wall because that's what he would do through our bedroom, and he was in the back bedroom, and I could hear it. I think I've had a couple of dreams about him, but I just, try to do things in his memory, like I said, doing this, and it's not easy, but it also gives me comfort, and knowing that was what Stephen wanted me to do, and was to say that, and I have done this, especially after everything was done, to stay in bed all day and just throw the covers over and not live life. And I had done that, but then I realized that wasn't going to bring Stephen back, nor would it be what Stephen wanted. Stephen had very openly said, I want you to go on with your life. And so that's what I'm trying to do, and trying to encourage my husband and my other sons to do the same thing, that Stephen would not want us wallowing around, and, he wanted us to live life, because that's what he said. He was very open about talking about that stuff. So, while it's difficult and it'll never go away, you kind of learn to incorporate it into your new normal. And, I pray every day, like that, asking God to please, let's get a cure, because we need to have CF stand for Cure Found. And too many young people are losing their lives because of that. And I feel very strongly about that. And also, of course, of organ donation. So,
well, thank you, Peggy, for sharing your story and for continuing to be a part of the CF community, and pray for all of our kids and be involved, because we definitely need you.
Yes, thank you.
And just thank you so much for sharing this journey. Yeah. And we're glad to remember and talk about Stephen all the time and anytime.
Well, I appreciate it. Thank you. Yeah, he was special. I know he's looking down, and he's proud. He's proud of all of us, I'm sure. I have no doubt of that.
The original music in this podcast is performed by Kevin Allen.
It's not complicated.
Who happens to have cystic fibrosis.
We all got our worries and fears. I know it's got you frustrated, but loving you is so alright.
This has been the Living with Cystic Fibrosis podcast. For more information and to learn more about the Bonnell Foundation, visit our website at thebonnellfoundation.org. That's the BONNELL Foundation.org. This podcast was sponsored by Vertex Pharmaceutical, The Science of Possibility, and Viatris. It was produced by Jag and Detroit Podcasts. Follow our show in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you're listening right now.